welcome to Starbound. If you're tired of AI-generated slop and want real human storytelling, please subscribe to support this channel. My name is I Am Duck. I'll be your narrator. Let's get into the story. Everything happened too fast for Torrin to comprehend. One moment he was a financial advisor helping his company secure a lucrative deal with the most powerful alien queen in the galaxy. And by nightfall he discovered that the queen had taken a personal liking to him. So much so that she had essentially bought him from his company for an undisclosed sum. Now he found himself in her private chambers, bewildered and disoriented, as Queen Solara entered wearing revealing garments, a leash in one hand and a whip in the other. The heavy crystalline door sealed behind her with a resonant song, the locking mechanism engaging silently. Torrin's breath caught in his throat as he took in the sight before him. Queen Solara stood there, a Lihari in her prime years, and every inch of her commanded attention in ways that made his human sensibility struggle between desire and alarm. Her hair was midnight black, a cascade of dark silk that flowed past her shoulders, down the curve of her back, reaching well below her hips in waves that seemed to absorb the warm, ambient light of the chamber. The length of it was almost hypnotic in its movement, swaying with each measured breath she took. Her eyes matched that same impossible darkness, not merely dark brown as human eyes might be, but truly black, depthless pools that reflected his own shape from across the room. Her skin was a delicate pink, almost translucent in its perfection, marked by distinctive white vertical stripes that adhered to her form. The stripes began at her temples, traced elegant lines down her high cheekbones, continued along the graceful column of her neck, and disappeared beneath the scandalously minimal garments she wore. The fabric, if it could even be called that, was some kind of flowing material that seemed more suggestion than substance, revealing the upper curves of her voluptuous chest, where those same white stripes continued their descent, vanishing into mysteries Torrin desperately tried not to contemplate. She moved toward him slowly, each step taking its time, her bare feet making no sound on the cushioned floor. The way she walked spoke of absolute confidence, of someone who had never once in her life questioned her right to any space she occupied. What are you doing? Torrin's voice cracked, betraying the panic that was rapidly consuming him. He pressed himself back against the ornate headboard of what he assumed was meant to be his bed, though calling it a bed seemed inadequate for the massive circular platform draped in fabrics that seemed more expensive than his annual income. Why did you bring me here? Queen Solara continued her approach, maintaining eye contact with an intensity that made him want to look away, though he found himself unable to break her gaze. Her posture remained impeccable, spine straight, shoulders back, perfection incarnate. Are you some kind of psycho who brought me here to torture me? The words tumbled out of him in a rush, his professional composure completely shattered. He'd spent 3 months preparing for the negotiations, learning Lihari customs, studying their body language, their trade practices, their complex social hierarchies. Nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this. She said nothing, only continued her slow advance. When she finally stopped, she was so close that he could feel the warmth of her breath on his face. It carried a scent like flowers, alien, but not unpleasant. Still, the proximity made him swallow hard, his throat suddenly dry as desert sand. She stood at exactly his height, their eyes level, and this close he could see that those black irises weren't uniform, but contained some subtle patterns, like oil on water, shifting and changing with the light. Terror coursed through his veins like ice water. This was Queen Solara of the Lihari Dominion, the woman who had survived no fewer than 5 assassination attempts. He'd read the reports, seen the footage of her calmly walking away from an exploding transport, her clothing singed but her expression unchanging. She had personally led her forces in 2 separate wars, emerging victorious both times through a combination of brilliant strategy and ruthless execution. The intelligence files his company had provided mentioned that she had overseen over 1,000 executions during her 20-year reign. And while most were carried out by her royal executioner, she had personally wielded the execution blade for at least a dozen of them. The story said she would stand before the condemned, give the order with the same calm expression she wore now, and then carry out the sentence herself when the crime was serious enough to awaken her ire. They said she never closed her eyes when the blade fell, never flinched at the spray of blood, never showed any emotion at all, except perhaps a subtle satisfaction that justice, as she defined it, had been served. And now she stood before him, close enough that he could see the pulse point at her throat. Just as his panic reached a crescendo, when he thought his heart might actually burst from the strain of his terror, Queen Solara did something that shattered every expectation, every protocol, every understanding he had of power dynamics between species, between sovereign and subject, between buyer and bought. She knelt. She sank down beside the bed, her knees touching the floor in silence, her hair pulled around her like spilled ink. And then, in a gesture that made no sense whatsoever in any context Torrin could imagine, she raised both hands, the leash in her left hand, the whip in her right, holding them up toward him in what looked unmistakably like an offering position. Her arms were extended, palms up, the objects resting across them like gifts on a pillow. She said nothing, not a single word of explanation, not a command, not even a suggestion. She simply held the position, her black eyes fixed on his face, waiting. Torrin's mind raced, thoughts colliding and fragmenting like particles in an accelerator. What was happening? What did she expect? Was this some kind of test? A ritual he was supposed to know about? His company's cultural briefings had covered dining etiquette, proper forms of address, gift-giving protocols, even the basics of Lihari mating displays, though that had been more of a warning about what to avoid than actual instruction. But this scenario had never come up in any documentation, any training simulation, any worst-case scenario planning session. He was afraid to look at her, truly look at her, but also afraid to look away. His eyes darted nervously between her face and the object she held, trying desperately not to let his gaze wander to the exposed portions of her skin, the curves badly concealed by that impossible fabric. Even in his terror, even in his complete confusion, he was acutely aware that she was beautiful in a way that transcended species, beautiful in a way that made his human brain struggle to process the information his eyes were providing. I don't... He started, then stopped, the words dying in his throat. He tried again. Your Majesty, I don't understand what you want from me. Still, she said nothing, only continued to kneel there, holding up the items, offering them. Is this... He swallowed again, forced himself to continue. Is this some kind of employment ritual? Am I supposed to choose? The silence stretched on, broken only by her calm heartbeat and his own ragged breathing. He stole glances at her, quick flickers of vision that he immediately directed elsewhere, to the walls, anything but the kneeling queen and her inexplicable offering. Interspecies interactions were notoriously complicated, fraught with misunderstandings that could escalate from amusing anecdotes 2 diplomatic incidents in the space of a single misinterpreted gesture. But this, he couldn't even identify what kind of relationship he was supposed to have with the Queen. Was he property now? An employee? Some kind of companion? The thought that wouldn't leave his mind, the one he kept pushing away but that kept returning with increasing insistence, was whether this was something more intimate, more forbidden, more dangerous than any of those options. The Lihari were known to take consorts from other species occasionally, though the practice was rare and typically involved elaborate courtship rituals that took years to complete. But those were consensual arrangements between equals, not whatever this was. He'd been sold, traded like a commodity, and now the Queen who had purchased him was kneeling at his bedside, offering him implements that suggested what? Dominance? Submission? Some alien concept his human mind couldn't even grasp. "Please," he said finally. "I don't know what you want. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. If I've offended you somehow, if there's some rule I'm supposed to follow, please just tell me. I'll do whatever you require, but I need to understand what this is." Their eyes met and held, hers black and unreadable, reflecting nothing but the strange inner light, his wide with fear and confusion, probably showing every thought that raced through his mind. Time stretched like taffy, each second feeling like minutes. The whip and leash remained steady in her hands, not wavering despite what must have been the strain of holding them aloft for so long. Her breathing remained even, calm, while his came in short, nervous bursts. At what might have been the half-hour mark, though time had become elastic and strange in that charged silence, Queen Solara finally moved. She rose to her feet with the same elegance with which she had knelt, the leash and whip still in her hands. Her expression, which had remained neutral throughout the entire ordeal, shifted slightly. Not quite disappointment, not quite annoyance, but something that suggested she had expected more. "You're boring," she said. Before he could respond, before he could even process what had just happened, she moved to the wall and touched a panel he hadn't noticed. The lights dimmed immediately, plunging the room into darkness. He felt the bed shift as she climbed onto it, and panic shot through him again. But she didn't touch him, didn't come near him. Instead, he felt her weight on the far side of the massive circular platform. Then, with a casualness that defied everything that had just transpired, she pulled a blanket over both of them, a single covering that was large enough to span the entire bed with room to spare. For a moment there was silence, and Torrin thought perhaps this surreal nightmare of an evening was over. Then she spoke again, her voice carrying clearly, despite not facing him. "You will have 2 more chances," she said, the words hanging in the air like a promise or a threat, he couldn't tell which. "Do try to be less tedious next time." And then, as if this was the most normal thing in the universe, as if she hadn't just shattered every conception he had of reality, of power, of his own situation, she added in a tone that sounded almost gentle, "Good night, Torrin." The sound of his name on her lips sent a shiver through him that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a recognition he wasn't ready to acknowledge. He lay there in the darkness, rigid as a board, his mind spinning with questions that had no answers, scenarios that made no sense, futures he couldn't envision. The Queen's breathing gradually deepened and slowed, suggesting she had actually fallen asleep, while Torrin remained wide awake, staring at the faint stars visible in the ceiling, wondering what in all the galaxies he had gotten himself into. The next day came and went with agonizing slowness, filled with nothing but following Queen Solara through her endless meetings, sharing wordless meals where she barely acknowledged his existence, and accepting whatever food the servant who shadowed him throughout the day offered. By evening, Torrin felt like a ghost haunting the palace, visible but irrelevant, present but purposeless. Now he stood in the corner of yet another meeting room, positioned near the Queen's security detail. Two imposing Lahari guards whose expressions never changed, and the servant who had been his constant companion since morning. The Queen sat at the head of the white table, her attention focused on some ambassador from a species Torrin didn't recognize, a being with too many appendages and not enough eyes. Torrin glanced at the servant beside him, a female Lahari, whose features bore the same distinctive pink skin and white stripes as the Queen, though she possessed none of Solara's beauty, at least not to the eyes of a human like himself. Her face was pleasant enough, but ordinary, forgettable in the way that those who served in shadows often were. "How long have you worked for the Queen?" Torrin asked quietly, trying not to sound nosy, though desperation colored every word. The servant, Zavira, he'd learned her name was, shifted uncomfortably. 20 years, she said reluctantly, her voice low, all the way through her reign. "Great!" Torrin said enthusiastically, immediately regretting how loudly the word had escaped. One of the guards glanced their way, and he shrank back against the wall. He proceeded in a much lower voice, leaning closer to Zavira. "Listen, I need to understand what the Queen wants from me. I'm completely lost here. Can you help me, please?" Zavira's expression tightened. "I serve Her Majesty. I don't question her decisions. But surely you must know something." Torrin pressed, keeping his voice low. "You've been here 20 years. You must have seen—" "I prefer not to know the Queen's private business," Zavira interrupted, her tone firm despite the whisper. Torrin noticed that Queen Solara wasn't paying attention to them at all. She was currently humiliating the multi-armed ambassador with a vocabulary so sophisticated and cutting that Torrin could barely comprehend half the insults being delivered. The ambassador seemed to be shrinking with each word, its many arms drawing closer to its body in what looked like universal submission. Taking advantage of the moment, Torrin turned back to Zavira, desperation making him bold. "Please," he whispered urgently, "you truly don't know anything about what the Queen wants from me at night? Nothing at all?" Zavira looked at him for a long moment, then at the Queen, who was still dissecting the ambassador's proposal with malice. Finally, she leaned close enough that her breath tickled his ear. "You're not the first," she whispered. "You're the third." Torrin's stomach dropped, but Zavira continued before he could respond. "I think the Queen gets lonely from time to time. She does this, invites a male from other species to her chambers. I know nothing of what happens inside, but I know it never lasts long. The Queen returns the males very quickly." The words hit Torrin like a physical blow. Not the first, not special. The fleeting thought that maybe the Queen had seen something unique in him during the negotiations vanished like smoke. Worse, if the others had been returned quickly, what did that mean for his own fate? His life might literally depend on understanding what she wanted. He noticed the Queen was still occupied with the ambassador, whose species apparently didn't require much oxygen because it hadn't taken a breath during her entire 5-minute evisceration of his trade proposal. "What happened to the others?" Torrin asked urgently. Zavira sighed. "The first was 5 years ago. A Kronak. Big, 4 arms, you know the type. It was over in the first night." She paused, glancing at the Queen. Her Majesty commented after sending him back to his planet that the Kronak was boring and smelled bad. Despite his anxiety, Torrin found himself smiling slightly. At least the Queen had only said he was boring, nothing about bad smells. That had to count for something, right? He looked at Queen Solara again. She had moved on from insulting the ambassador's proposal to questioning its entire species' evolutionary development. The poor creature looked ready to dissolve into its component atoms just to escape. "What about the second?" Torrin asked. "I've already said too much," Zavira protested, but something in Torrin's desperate expression must have moved her. 2 years ago. He's still locked up in the dungeon beside the palace." Torrin's blood turned to ice. "The dungeon?" "The Queen said he was boring," Zavira whispered, "and apparently he readjusted the thermostat at some point during their first night together. She was furious in the morning." The realization hit Torrin like a shock of cold water. He was the first who would spend a second night with the Queen. The Chronarch had been sent away immediately. The second is rotting in a dungeon for the crime of adjusting the temperature. And here he was, having survived one night of complete confusion, facing another with the knowledge that a single mistake in interpreting her intentions might send him to join the thermostat adjuster in the depths of the palace. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. 3 hours later, back in the Queen's chamber, Torrin found himself checking his own smell as he paced anxiously in front of her bed, staring at the crystal door where he knew for certain the Queen was about to emerge from. He'd washed 3 times, used some kind of Lahari cleansing solution that tingled on his skin, and even attempted to tame his hair into something presentable. The leash and whip were nowhere to be seen, but he suspected they would appear soon enough. The door opened with the same resonant song, and Queen Solara entered. She wore even less than the night before, if such a thing was possible. The fabric clung to strategic points of her body, like morning dew on spider silk, leaving vast expanses of pink skin with its white stripes on display. In her hands, as expected, were the leash and the whip. She moved toward him with the same slowness, each step purposeful. Her midnight hair swayed with her movement, and her black eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made him forget to breathe. When she reached the bed, she sank to her knees again, assuming the same position as the night before, arms extended, palms up, the leash in her left hand, the whip in her right, offering them to him in silence. Torrin knew asking questions was useless now. The Queen expected him to do something with those items, but she would offer no explanation. If he did something she hated, he might end up in the dungeon with the temperature control enthusiast. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on him like the gravity of a blue star. A minute passed with her in that uncomfortable position and him frozen with indecision. His mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Fuck. The word escaped him before he could stop it. Frustration and fear finally overwhelming his paralysis, he reached out and took both items from her hands. Immediately he heard her heartbeat quicken. She maintained eye contact with him, still kneeling, and he realized his own heart wasn't any better. It hammered against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Among the fear and unexpected desire, he found himself wondering if he was supposed to wear the leash himself or put it on her. The whip was too much for him to even dare consider. The thought of striking the Queen who had ordered executions with her own hands was beyond contemplation. The choice seemed impossible, and he realized he had to test the waters before doing anything that would land him in the dungeon. His eyes traced the line of her garment, noting how the minimal fabric was held together by a series of delicate clasps. Making a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff, Torrin slowly reached for the first binding of her upper garment. He knew this wouldn't reveal much more than was already visible, but it would at least give him a chance to study her reaction. His fingers trembled as they found the clasp, and he carefully, fearfully, undid it. Her heartbeat increased noticeably, the sound somehow audible in the charged silence of the room. She said nothing, but the acceleration of her pulse told him he was doing something she approved of, or at least didn't disapprove enough to stop him. In that moment, his mouth acted faster than his thoughts. Would you mind if I kissed you? The look she gave him was pure disgust, mixed with disappointment, an expression that made his mind immediately conjure images of himself chained in the dungeon, forgotten and rotting like the second male. The contempt in her black eyes was so profound that he actually took a step back. His mind raced, battling to understand his mistake. Was it the assumption she wanted physical contact? But hadn't she approved his previous bold move with the clasp? Her heartbeat had increased, hadn't it? That had to mean something positive, didn't it? Then an idea occurred to him, wild and dangerous and possibly suicidal. "I don't believe I'm doing this," he muttered to himself before doubling down on his insane theory. With hands that shook despite his attempt at confidence, he wrapped the leash around her neck, pulling it tight enough to be secure, but not enough to hurt. Her reaction was neutral this time. No disgust, but no approval either. It left him no choice but to go even deeper into his idea, somehow controlling his mind enough to avoid panicking at the sight of himself holding the most powerful woman in the galaxy on a leash. He took a deep breath and spoke in what he hoped was a commanding voice. "Kiss me. Now." Not a question. An order. Her heartbeat increased dramatically, the rhythm fast and strong. Before he could fully process what was happening, the most powerful woman in the galaxy was in his lap, her lips pressed against his, her face warm while both their heartbeats thundered so loudly they almost drowned out the gentle noises their mouths produced. She tasted like that alien flower scent she carried, sweet and strange and intoxicating. When the Queen broke their kiss, their eyes met, and Torrin, with a spark of understanding about her wants that felt like playing with fire, simply said, "Bad girl, more tongue next time." She smiled. It was the first time he'd seen her smile, and it transformed her face from coldly beautiful to something achingly real. What followed was almost a full hour of exploring touches, of him slowly trying and failing to find where the line existed, how far he should go in this dangerous game where one mistake might send him to the dungeon. He learned that commands made her breath quicken, that gentle touches made her pull away, that she wanted him to take control in ways that went against every instinct he had about how to treat someone who could order his death with a word. His fingers traced the white stripes on her skin, following their paths down her arms, across her shoulders. He gave orders he never thought he'd voice, each one making her black eyes shine brighter. The whip remained on the floor, untouched, a bridge he couldn't bring himself to cross, not yet, maybe not ever. When finally she pulled away, her lips were marked by his bites, small indentations that would fade by morning, but for now marked her as something other than the untouchable queen. She moved to the wall, touched the panel, and the lights dimmed to darkness. The bed shifted as she climbed onto it, and then, just like the night before, she pulled the blanket over both of them. This time, though, she broke the silence. "Today wasn't boring," she said, a voice containing a note of something that might have been satisfaction. "But the whip is still on the ground, and our clothes are still on. I think you're a coward." Before he could respond, she added, "One more chance tomorrow." Then she turned away from him, her breathing already beginning to slow towards sleep, leaving Torrin to lie in the darkness with the taste of her still on his lips, and the terrifying knowledge that tomorrow would be his last chance to understand what the alien queen truly wanted from him, though he was far from clueless this time around. The third day passed like an endless, bureaucratic nightmare, where Torrin's mind struggled to reconcile the two versions of Queen Solara that now existed in his world. There was the Queen of Daylight, imperious, cold, conducting meetings with the accuracy of a surgeon and the mercy of a blade. Then there was the Queen from his memories of the previous night, warm, skin marked by his teeth, black eyes wide with something that might have been pleasure, heartbeat racing under his commands. The cognitive dissonance was almost painful. He spent the day locked in his own head, following her through corridors and conference rooms like a well-trained shadow, while his thoughts churned with plans for the coming night. A war raged inside him about how far he was willing to go with the alien queen without risking his own imprisonment. The man in the dungeon had adjusted a thermostat. Torrin was contemplating things far more audacious, things that made his palms sweat just thinking about them. During a trade negotiation with representatives from distant star systems, he watched her dissect their proposals, one by one, her voice never rising above a conversational tone even as she reduced grown beings to stammering apologies. How could this be the same woman who had knelt beside his bed, who had smiled when he'd called her a bad girl? The day crawled forward, each hour an eternity. Meals passed in silence, meetings blurred together. Zavira brought him food he didn't taste, water he drank mechanically. All the while his mind spun scenarios, possibilities, plans that ranged from cautious to insane. When night finally came, it arrived with the same anticipation as before. But this time the balance between anticipation and fear had shifted dangerously. Desire had overtaken precaution, and despite his awareness that this was usually the recipe for disaster, he couldn't bring himself to care. Humans like him were living contradictions, intelligent enough to recognize danger, foolish enough to walk toward it anyway. He remained steady, staring at the door and awaiting the queen. His queen. The crystal door opened like always. The routine was established now. The scandalous garments that barely qualified as clothing, the midnight hair flowing like liquid shadow, the slow walk toward him. In her hands, as always, the leash and the whip. But Torrin was not helpless this time. He knew what she wanted, or thought he did, and had decided to give the queen more than what she expected tonight. When she knelt beside the bed and offered him both items, he simply smiled. Slowly he extended his index finger and nudged the leash from her hand, letting it fall to the ground with a soft thud. Then, with the same casual dismissal, he pushed away the whip. Both objects now lay on the floor, rejected. A hint of surprise flickered across her face. The first genuine emotion he'd seen from her during this ritual. Then he laughed. "You think you know what's going to happen tonight," he said, his voice carrying a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "But I assure you, you don't." From his pocket he withdrew the knife he'd stolen during dinner. A small blade he'd hidden when she wasn't paying attention. The metal caught the light as he pulled it free, and he heard her heartbeat surge stronger than ever before. The sound filled the room like thunder. He touched the cold blade to her neck, just enough for her to feel the metal against her skin. Her black eyes went wide, but she didn't move, didn't even breathe. Then, with agonizing slowness, he moved the blade down. Not to threaten, not to harm, but to hook it under the delicate fabric of her upper garment. With one swift motion, he cut it open, leaving her exposed and her eyes wider than he'd ever seen them. The next hours were the craziest of his life. What followed was a dance of power and surrender, of pushing boundaries and discovering that some boundaries were meant to be pushed. The queen who commanded star systems submitted to his commands. The woman who had ordered executions gasped at his touch. The cold, calculating ruler became something else entirely under his hands, something raw and real and achingly vulnerable. When it was over, when they finally collapsed together in exhaustion, the queen had broken her pattern. They lay beneath the blankets with the lights still on, their bodies intertwined in a way that felt both alien and perfectly natural. What he saw beside him was a figure so thoroughly marked by the encounter that he knew for certain the makeup professionals would have to perform a miracle to make the queen presentable in the morning. Love marks decorated her neck like a necklace of passion, each one telling the story of how far they traveled from their first confusing night. Her breathing was still quick, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she tried to recover her composure. When she spoke, her voice was shy in a way that seemed impossible for someone who had never shown weakness in public. "You passed the test," she said quietly. "I'll keep you." Questions exploded in his mind. Keep him forever? Keep him for now? Keep him until she grew bored like she had with the others? But he didn't dare ask, not when the moment felt so fragile, so precious. Instead, he shook his head slightly and asked, "What will I gain after passing this test?" She turned to look at him, those black eyes reflecting the light. "Is more time with me not enough?" He reached out and playfully touched the tip of her nose, a gesture so casual and intimate it would have been unthinkable just days ago. "If by more time you mean forever, then sure." She said nothing to that, and he didn't press. The silence stretched between them, comfortable now rather than charged with tension. Eventually, she said, "We should sleep now." He laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "If this is all the conversation we're going to have, that's fine." She reached for the light switch on the wall panel, but he stopped her midway through the motion, catching her wrist gently but firmly. With his other hand, he reached past her and adjusted the thermostat to the coldest temperature setting, doing it slowly and deliberately so she could see every adjustment he made. The cold gaze she gave him could have frozen suns. "I like it warm," she said, her tone as icy as the temperature he just set. He laughed again, pulling her back toward the bed. "And since when does what you like matter?" Her eyes widened in surprise at his audacity, the shock clear on her face. Before she could respond, he added more gently, "Come here. Let me warm you through the night." Her gaze alternated between the thermostat and him, clearly weighing her options. She could override his adjustment, assert her authority, remind him who held the power in the daylight hours. But in the end she sighed, a sound of surrender that was somehow more intimate than everything that had come before, and surrendered to his embrace. He pulled her close, feeling the coolness already beginning to creep into the room. Her skin was warm against his, and he could feel her heartbeat against his chest, still faster than normal. The white stripes on his skin seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, creating patterns he traced with his fingers. "You're enough for me," he whispered into her ear, his breath stirring her dark hair. "I'm satisfied with this arrangement. The most powerful queen in the galaxy during the day, and my plaything during the night." She held him tightly, taking a long while before sleep finally claimed her. No more words were spoken. None were needed. Tomorrow would bring its share of challenges and complexities, but tonight was theirs, and that was enough.